Ready?
Yes,
Let's
I'm
have some
excited.
fun. Hello, and welcome back to the Beta 3 Squad podcast. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. My name is Liran. I'm a pediatric speech language pathologist. And today we are talking about one of my favorite topics in language acquisition, and that is language understanding, or receptive language, if you will. After you listen to this episode, you should have a better idea of what language understanding is and how you can help kids under the age of 3 establish great understanding. We're also going to share with you a couple of tips and tricks on how professionals help promote understanding with this age group. And in order to assist me with delivering such an important message, I would like to introduce my first guest for today. You're getting a 2-for-1 special speechy panel. I would like to introduce the wonderful Kristen. Hi, Kristen.
Hey, LeBron.
Hi.
Thank you so much for having me today. It is super exciting listening to your podcast and just the different kind of information that you're bringing to light for all of our families is really wonderful. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you for taking part in it. Two brains are always better than one.
I know. And we're about to nerd out over this subject.
Right. Actually, I'm going to take a chance and tell you a really corny joke that I heard in a convention a couple of months ago. I hope people are not going to turn off the podcast after that.
I'm so ready.
What happens when you put two speech therapists in a room?
So many things, but please tell me the punchline.
They articulate a wonderful talk show.
Oh, there you go. No, that is the truth. I mean, being a speech therapist, you definitely have most of us have a gift for gab. So I'm really excited
Right.
to be able to discuss this, in a way that's not rushed or, just between visits or something, and really get to the heart of such an important topic of that receptive language, because as we know, it's the foundation for language learning and it's really important to understand.
Right, which already tells you that the content of this episode will be a whole lot better than the jokes. So don't give up on me. Okay, so let's start with just defining what receptive language is, or what do we look at when we come in as early as, when the babies are 6 months old. What are we looking when it comes to receptive language or language understanding?
Yeah, I think that's amazing because receptive language really does start at the very, very beginning. And I think sometimes when we're thinking about receptive language, we think about response to name and following directions. And while all of those things are so important, thinking back to 6 months, you're already kind of seeing response to name. You're seeing the child and the baby recognizing different people that they're familiar with, tones of voice, and just being able to track voices around the room. So it starts so early on, and it really just continues to blossom into how children take in their world around them and understand what people are saying to them so that they can eventually communicate.
Right. And I think one of the classic games that we try to do with babies, or even later on, is those anticipatory games, the peekaboo games. To me, that's a great example for language understanding.
Right.
Because through that game, the child already understands the rules of the game. When mommy or daddy hide their face and then remove that pillow, the rule of the game is that the parent is always there.
Mm-hmm.
So that builds the understanding of what happens when mommy says peekaboo. So I think once you see attention to that kind of game, or that anticipation, oh, this is about to happen, that's a great example of how the child makes connection between the word and what is about to happen.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that.
So to me, that's really the definition of language understanding: making connections or associations between a word and a person,
Mm-hmm.
or an action, or an activity, or any type of action response that's going to happen after that word is being presented.
Yeah.
So when we come in, we look for those signs.
Totally. And you even see, when someone approaches a child, immediately they play those kinds of games like, oh, I got your nose. And they're waiting for that response. And that kind of early communication and conversation can start with those social games.
Right.
So I love that example.
Sometimes when we come in and there are some red flags for understanding, one of the biggest obstacles for language understanding is attention. Mm-hmm. So if I'm playing peekaboo with my kid and they're busy running around the room, maybe at that point crawling still, looking away, then the child really doesn't understand the rules of the game. And then the understanding is not established. So how many times do you come in and the parent is concerned about understanding or following directions, but the big obstacle in their way is really those attention skills?
Oh, yeah, all the time. And until we get that attention and kind of teach them, like, oh, being with other people is so much fun. We need to teach them through those people games, teach them through, that excitement and animation that we can kind of offer them so that we become more exciting to engage with. And I think once that kind of piece is unlocked, we get so much more joint attention. And joint attention, as we know, is everything for play and beyond.
Right. So joint attention is what we consider language understanding, right? Are we both on the same page? Are we both looking at the same thing? Sometimes we make those connections with like the pointing skills, but we're going to talk more about that in a couple of minutes. What do you think from your experience is one of the biggest misconceptions when we talk to parents about receptive skills or understanding? What are those things that they consider or we consider to be a myth?
Yeah. I think sometimes when you're a parent and you're going through the daily routines with your kids and they get really familiar with the things that you say, it starts to look like they understand everything. And I think that's a line that we all hear a lot. Oh, they understand everything. It's just that they're not talking. And then when we kind of break it down, we're like, wait, do we realize how much support we're giving them that they may not actually be listening? They are relying on hearing the bath turn on to know that it's bath time. And then they're running to the bathroom. So that to the parent looks like, well, of course, they understand bath time and they understand when it's time to go because we're all getting our shoes on at the door. And then we're kind of stepping it back and peeling it back. And we're like, well, what if we were to give them something that maybe didn't have a visual piece or an auditory piece? And then I think it kind of connects like, oh, are they processing? Are they listening? Are they actually understanding? Or are they relying on like our extra support and cues?
Right. And that is what professionals, I think, have the eye for. Mm-hmm. And when you're a parent, you're going through the motions, really hard to take that all apart, right, and see whether or not understanding is truly established. I think, a lot of parents miss the mark on that, but not necessarily. It's not necessarily their fault. So when you come in, and I think, the pediatricians kind of contribute to that misconception. When you come in and we're talking about the child's language skills, the biggest conversation happens around how many words do they have? So when you go into that well visit at 12 months, the first thing the doctor is going to ask you, so how many words can Johnny say? Can he say mama yet? And if they didn't meet the quota on how many words they need to say according to that pediatrician, now we're concerned. Mm-hmm. So that's, I think, one misconception when we're talking about language development. The other thing that contributes to that misconception is technology or those TV shows or these apps that they're trying to convince you, the parent, that's going to make your child say a lot of words, use a lot of words. And, a lot of parents think that is educational, and they encourage the child to use these apps or watch these specific TV shows so they can start repeating words. But if you haven't figured it out yet from this conversation, the first step in language acquisition is actually language understanding. So if my child can imitate a lot of words from screens or from people, but they don't have true understanding of what those words are, they are acquiring language totally out of order. And that's when we come in, the speechies, and we have to fix that. And we have to encourage parents to work on language understanding and take a step back from just getting the child to say words.
Yeah. And I think what the point you're bringing up here is that the words are the most exciting part to families because everyone wants to hear their baby's voice. Everyone wants to hear their toddler imitate things and their baby babble and make new sounds. So there's such an emphasis on the output when the receptive language is the behind the scenes stuff. It's not as appealing. It's not as fun, but it's all the important gears turning and working to actually, further create that output, whether that output actually be verbal or not. It can be through gestures and pictures and communication devices, but the receptive language really at all times is going to be the catalyst for that output.
Right. And that's when if a child does say those words, but they don't have the understanding, that word is not functional for them. Right? We always compare it to learning another language, even as an adult. You could teach me a word in French. I could probably repeat it, but do I have any idea what I said? Could I use it anywhere else on my own? Could I show you what it is around the room? There is no true benefit to just repeating words without good understanding.
Absolutely. It is the most important.
Right. So I don't know who needs to hear that. I mean, probably everybody, but you hear it from two speech language pathologists. Language skills are built on language understanding, not the ability to repeat words. So let's move on to, from your experience, what is usually new information, something new we teach parents about language understanding that they didn't know before.
Yeah. Something I like to share is that everyone needs time to process and take in new information. So when you are speaking to a child, a baby, especially birth to 3, so much is new to them almost all the time. So they just need a beat to kind of listen to what you said and process. If they don't follow that direction the first time, it's okay. You don't have to repeat yourself 2 seconds later, or then, maybe stop and then do the direction yourself. Maybe just give them a moment to listen to what you actually said. And then if we need to, then we can repeat. But there are many children that just need a couple seconds to really take in what you said in order to be able to complete, what was asked of them.
Right. And sometimes as parents, when we really want to show somebody, look how smart my kid is, we might ask them to follow that direction 5 different times before we actually give them the opportunity to follow.
Right.
And that's when you as a speech therapist just cringe on the inside and say, it's okay. Give them a moment.
Totally.
And let's see how the wheels are turning. Mm-hmm. Let's see the processing. Yeah. And sometimes if you take a moment and just look at their face after you said something, that will give you a lot of information about
huge
processing.
Huge indicator. And I know a lot of families are like, well, this child can say their ABCs and this child is singing. And I always say, I'm like, that's a party trick. Like, that's just something that's on command and it's great and it's fun and exciting. But how much stock do we put in that for communication? Not so much. So those parents that are stressing, why is my child maybe not doing this or saying this on command? Not everyone wants to be on the spot all the time. And, just considering again, like what is happening behind the scenes there.
And, I think some of the new information we bring in when we talk about understanding, and I think many parents don't make that connection between the two skills, the pointing skills.
Oh, yes.
Right? Pointing is actually a huge tool to demonstrate what a child knows. So, as early as 12-month-old kids, and obviously there's a range, but we start seeing them isolating their finger to a point to ask you for something they see out of reach. So that's really one of the things we look for as speech therapists that demonstrate understanding. Do I understand that when I point to that item out of reach and I look at mommy, there's that joint attention, we're both attending to the same thing, and you understand me that I want that specific item. And then from there, we should really see that develop into the pointing to identify. And, anybody that works with me knows that I'm the pointing police. I put so much weight on pointing skills for language development because I know it's the building block for general language skills. So that's when you want to see those associations. If I say nose and the child is pointing to nose, or I say, where's mommy? And they're pointing to mommy. I say, where's light? They're looking up. Then I know they're making connections. I know that understanding is established. But the only way to test that is whether or not the child is pointing to what I say. So I think when we come in and we talk so much about pointing and the parent says, but I just want them to say words, we have to really educate parents on what are those building blocks that will get your child to that level of saying words to communicate with you. There has to be that joint understanding first.
The point is so powerful because you can use it for commenting and requesting. So I do love that idea of using it for multiple purposes, and it really starts with the parent modeling. So some parents will be like, well, how do we get this ball rolling if it's so important? So we always say, you start pointing things out when you're outside, when you're on a walk.
That's a great point.
There's no shame in being silly and acting around your kids and just really offering them all kinds of gestures. Oh, mommy's looking for her phone. Oh, there it is. That kind of gestural support is really powerful and helpful.
Right.
Yeah, so much help and support from the parents.
Right. And that brings me to ask you, what do you think is unique to the birth to 3 age group when we talk about receptive skills? Like obviously the learning or establishing understanding at that age looks a little bit different than later on. In your opinion, what is unique to that age group?
Yeah, so I just think for receptive language, it clues us into so much more than like, is my baby understanding? The receptive language really supports play. It supports social skills, because if you're playing with a child and you give them a new direction, maybe let's make a garage with your blocks and let's park the car inside the garage. If this is kind of over their head and they're lost, the play actually may not be as advanced, or the play may not be as complex. So understanding helps the play. Understanding helps that social piece of interacting back and forth, because you need to know what someone's saying to you in order to respond. And that's social, that's back and forth. So I just love that kind of has its tentacles everywhere.
Right.
And I think that is so unique about, receptive language learning.
One of the terms that usually we talk about, and that's pretty new to parents. I mean, if you're not in the profession of language, that you're probably not going to use that term, but within that age group, there is the ability to develop language very quickly or understand language very quickly. We call that process fast mapping. Mm-hmm. That's when a child at that age has that window to make a lot of these connections and associations very rapidly. I think the research says that in typical development, a typical 18-month-old is able to understand, we're just talking about understanding, not saying words, they're able to understand about 9 new words every day.
Wow.
So think about that over a period of time of like a year or two. They're really able to absorb so much language so quickly. Us as adults, if I want to learn a new language right now and I want to try and understand what people are saying, those associations are made slowly. Also, I'm relying on a system I already have. I compare it to the language I know already. So the whole language learning process is completely different. So if we capitalize on that little window that we have to really boost their language understanding, we are getting a very well-rounded child that understands a lot of what we're saying.
Yeah. And I think that whole idea of like just talking to your babies throughout the day, a lot of parents are like, well, then how do we help? It's like, let's talk to them. And I tell parents a lot of times, I'm like, quality over quantity. You don't have to be talking all day through every routine, because that's just a lot. and parents have a lot on their plates, and almost no one has that kind of energy stored away magically to just be animated and talking. But if we are picking some nice core vocabulary for each routine, if before we eat is going to be the word that we're introducing, before bath time, if it's going to be wash, being just even a little bit more mindful of the words that you are teaching during the day is going to make a huge difference versus you just feeling like you have to kind of talk and really be the entertainment for the day.
Right. And again, that takes us back to that joint attention. Am I talking while this child is like dumping their toys and moving around the room? Or am I talking to my baby and my baby's paying attention to me? So that's also a crucial part of language processing. You have to have that attention to faces, attention to what that adult is trying to teach you so you can actually use it yourself later.
Yeah.
So, we would like to share some of the tips and tricks that we use to establish great understanding. So what do you think are some of the go-to strategies when we advise parents to work on understanding receptive language a little bit more? What could we equip them with to put in their toolbox?
Yeah, I think going back to that point of being just animated, so many of our babies are so visual because they're on the go, they're on the move. Again, everything's new, so they're so excited. They're exploring their environment. So to catch their attention, we really do have to kind of compete with the environment. So I do suggest, let's say you guys are trying to get out of the house and you're looking for something. Maybe we offer this gesture, where is it? Oh, we're looking for something. And I've even modeled that during, sessions with families, and the child just thinks it's interesting or fun. And they just kind of start to do it without even knowing why. But when you're animated, you offer those gestures, it does help them listen.
Right.
And when they're listening, then they can kind of process. And, speaking of imitation and the emphasis that parents put on that output, this is output. This is output. And we really do rely on giving them something to imitate that's going to help them eventually learn that gestures are forms of communication, helping the point come in. So I think that idea of knowing that gestures are a little bit maybe easier to imitate for our babies than sounds at some points, that gross motor development, that gross motor imitation comes in first. So that is definitely a strategy I would recommend. Being animated, being big, and being interesting to look at.
I know you had worked for early intervention. You see a lot of families with kids under the age of 3. A lot of parents are frustrated where they say, I really try to point to a lot of things and I try to say a lot of words, but I don't see my child making progress with that. And that's when we model how to make them use those gestures with hand over hand. Mm-hmm. And that's a mind-blowing strategy for a lot of families because you kind of expect kids to just pick up on that skill, but you never think about like physically showing them what you expect them to do. So if we go in and a family really needs help with establishing pointing skills, we might say, put your hand on the baby's hand, isolate it to a point, and start making them point to everything that you name, everything that you offer. And then the brain makes the connection. Oh, when mommy says where, I know I'm supposed to point to something. When I want my bottle, I know that is what is going to get me the thing that I want. But sometimes it does require a lot of physical practice. Some kids are able to pick up on language and make those connections just auditorily, just hearing you say that. But some kids need the physical practice. So that's when that physical learning is a huge part for making language connections or associations. So I like that strategy.
Yeah, I love that physical piece of it because it helps them, like you said, do it themselves. It's that like working memory. So sometimes I'll suggest to families, if we want to get them interested in like touching, pages in the book and just kind of like being more interactive than flipping, why don't we do things like put a little Cheerio on top of the picture and then, oh, they're going for the Cheerio, but they actually touched the monkey in the meantime and acting as if, they just touched it purposefully. Oh, you found the monkey. There it is. So there are different ways to encourage that kind of connection.
Right.
Pointing, just touching, all of that is so important.
Right. And if you use repetitions, like you said, every time we look at the monkey, there's a Cheerio there. Now we're practicing that over and over again. And again, my brain makes that connection that every time X happens, Y happens.
Yes.
So we definitely encourage repetitions. Another thing that we probably both see very often is the following direction piece. That shows language understanding. If I say, Johnny, go get your shoes, he's getting the right thing. I know there's language understanding there. But what happens if I say, wear your shoes, and Johnny's not getting his shoes? How do I teach him what shoes are?
Yeah. Oh man, it's really crazy when you think about like that is just such an important part of a daily routine, and when it's not connecting, you realize that we may just miss that opportunity to teach him because we start to do it ourselves, and then we just kind of go through the motions. So I do think there's a couple ways to look at this, even just breaking it down to teaching him what shoes are and, pointing it out in different settings, labeling it for him. Mommy's shoes, these are mommy's shoes, pointing it out in, pictures in a book and just presenting it to them in different ways so they can generalize. But I do love that, going back to your part of like the physical prompting, it's really important to just kind of get that first step of just making sure they're listening by looking at you. So just getting down to their eye level. And if we're giving them that chance, get your shoes, and it's just not clicking, then in that moment, it would be helpful to maybe put his hands on his shoes and bring them over to where you asked, or, bring them to your hands and, always kind of reinforce, those are your shoes. That was great giving mommy shoes. So you are able to help them through that process. And I think, some children just need that. And that's going to help them connect.
Right. And think about how we learn things most of the time when we go to work. We kind of do similar things every day. We attach it to a certain routine. I come in the morning, I do that one thing that I always do. And then right before lunch break, I try to get something done. The same thing happens with children. They learn the same thing based on the routine you expose them to. So to your example, every time before we leave the house, I emphasize shoes. Now my child is making a connection between shoes and going outside. But for busy parents, sometimes we just forget that is a job that I could give my child as opposed to doing it all myself. So I think it's a lot easier to work on these skills within a routine, not only for the child, but also as the parent.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think we joke about that with parents. We're like, do you really need help, setting up the stage for bath time and getting towel, or, having your child get their shoes? No, but it's an opportunity for learning. And as their parent, you're helping them so much by just taking that extra second to give them a chance to learn something new and be involved. And I do think children do kind of want to please their parents. They want that praise and encouragement. So when they receive that positive feedback for doing a little job, putting their cup in the sink, something simple like that, it's really magical how over just a couple days, a couple weeks, it does start to become a habit. And then maybe it does end up being helpful that they do start to put their cup in their sink or grab the towel for the bath. So I think that's a great point.
Given that this is a different time for raising children, what will you say to parents who use technology or screen time as a way of encouraging language learning? So I think we see trends in that. A few years ago, everybody was watching Cocomelon. That was like the go-to show. Now I think Miss Rachel kind of took over a little bit, and everybody's trying to convince us that that's a great educational tool and that my kid can say what Miss Rachel can. What is your opinion as a speech language pathologist on using screen time or apps to encourage language at this age?
Yeah. So, I mean, if we're really going to be strict, of course, our answer is no screen time. Just because
you could say that louder.
No screen time. But really, it's something that is always around, and like you said, it's just really a different time. The reason we say the official recommendation is no screen time is because we know it's a passive activity. We know that their brains are not actively engaged. Whatever they're repeating is simply that, it's repeating. So the connection there is really that it's so much better for parents to watch Miss Rachel rather than, having the child be the one watching, because I do think parents can gain some strategies that she does use because she's getting their attention, obviously. So something is working really, really well for her. And I think what works well for her is she has that slow, and then it gets really animated. And then she tends to use the visual that she's holding up what she's talking about. And it's so engaging. So when parents start to implement some of those things, it can be helpful. But that being said, sometimes we need it as a tool. If we have to cook something, if we have to run to the bathroom, that's just the reality of using it more of a tool than an activity.
Right. As opposed to like relying on that to promote languages and not the adult. Mm-hmm. I think when I come in and we have the conversation about Miss Rachel, and nothing against Miss Rachel, if you're watching this and you would like to come on this podcast, we welcome everyone. And it would be actually very interesting to hear how she views
screen time.
When we have the conversation about the Miss Rachel as an educational tool, I think we often see a trend where kids are starting to respond more to Miss Rachel, to the screen prompting them, than the adult. If you haven't gathered that yet, I want to emphasize that the foundation for language is really the language understanding, not so much how many words the child can say. That is not a predictor for any kind of language skill.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that was even something that I learned going through schooling. And, when I used to dream of being a speech therapist, I'm going to help so many children learn to talk. And yes, we do that, but we work on a lot of the, foundational pre-linguistic skills. And there are just so many that have to come into play before we get that true language and communication. And I did have a colleague once that said, there is no app to replace your lap. And I think that was one of the most amazing ways that you could communicate to a parent. The magic is not happening with these tools and these toys where you put the flashcard in and you press the button and then they say the word and maybe the child repeats it. The magic happens when you're playing. They're on your lap. They're looking at your face, and we have that connection there for them to understand.
I love that. That's going to be maybe the title for this episode. There's no app to replace your lap.
Yeah.
And we can obviously talk about language and screen time. It would probably be its own episode. So I do want to leave everyone with kind of like that powerful slogan that you just provided us with. So thank you for that. And before I let you go, I would like to make a small request.
Yes.
From parents, from anybody that really wants to learn about development. So if you're listening to this podcast, you're probably part of the squad that wants to learn about language acquisition and how to give our children the tools to reach their full potential. And since we are in the era of social media and technology, the only way for us to really reach a lot of people and have this information reach enough parents so they could feel equipped is actually through a subscribe button or a follow button. So if it's not too much to ask, let's try to grow this community. And if you enjoyed this episode or other episodes, you can please subscribe, or follow us so that we could spread this information and make sure that our babies are getting the best type of developmental tools to be the best communicators they can be.
Yeah.
And lastly, I would like to deeply thank Kristen for our 2-for-1 special today and helping me unpack the huge topic of language understanding. It wouldn't have been so enjoyable without another speech therapist by my side. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me here today and doing such an amazing job taking that initiative, just sharing this information in a way that's so easy to understand. And, I know that if I were a parent and I were to see something like this, even just listening to it on a drive or, even just in my headphones while I'm cleaning or something, it could definitely help me understand how to help my child. And I think that's what you're doing. You're empowering the parents and giving them access to just fun tidbits of information that you don't need to go out of your way to see a specialist for. You're making it accessible, and that's so important. So thank you.
Oh, thank you for that. It's very kind. So see you guys next time.